I've been asked by a few people about the story of how a Volkswagen diesel got jammed in a Massey Harris 22 tractor and the real story behind it. The Model 22 Massey Harris tractor was produced from 1948 to 1953. I don't know the exact year on this one, so I'm just going to say 1950s. Just to be simple, I've never bothered looking up the serial number, and I really don't care what the year is because I'm not restoring it and it doesn't really mean anything to me at all. So for the simplicity of this video, I'm just going to say my grandfather. I'm not quite sure exactly how the relevance in the family became. So my grandfather grew up as a farmer, just like pretty much everybody else in this country. Once he retired, he started restoring the old tractors that he used to work with or grew up working on. The one tractor he had was a row crop Massey Harris 22. Obviously that one got restored because that was essentially, it meant something to him. Somehow along the lines over the years, they actually cracked the frame or had broke it off right at the transmission bell housing. So he had welded it back together but didn't get it quite straight. Apparently, as you can see the twist in this frame. So I guess that was something that probably bothered him, especially for restoring a classic tractor. Generally a twisted frame doesn't look right. So he went looking around and he found this exact tractor. Of course, as you can tell, most of you have noticed the body tin is in really rough shape. This thing was sitting in a fence row, basically rotting away, and it was essentially garbage. The only thing that was any good was the frame. That's exactly the reason why he bought this tractor, was for the frame to replace on that row crop tractor. This is a wide front end, so they're not nearly as desirable as the row crop. The row crop also had 3-point hitch, which is quite rare on these tractors. So it was super highly desirable. So this thing just basically got sabotaged for the frame, shoved back in the shed for parts, because you never know what you're going to need. Fast forward, he got that tractor fixed up, and he had this thing laying around, and he always drove Jettas back in the day, 1.6 liter Volkswagen turbo diesels. And so when one of his Jettas rotted out, he kept the engine because he figured he'd stuff it into something. He did that. He used to build everything. He used to build junk like this. Basically, he'd stuff things that didn't belong into things that, well, didn't belong to have that engine in them. So for the ones of you that have noticed, this is a 1.6 liter turbo diesel Volkswagen indirect injected from about a 1985 or so Volkswagen Jetta. So 1.6D is the block casting number for any of you that do understand that part. So obviously this never belonged in this tractor. Originally this tractor would have had a flathead Continental gas engine in it. This engine, from sitting in the fence row all those years and probably getting water down an open exhaust pipe, was not beyond repair but just about there, and without a ton of money the engine more or less wasn't fixable. So he had this hankering that since the tractor was basically scrap, you know, why not try to do something? Why not try to do something that he's always wanted to do? He liked building things like this. It gave him something to do, and he stuffed this Volkswagen turbo diesel into a Massey Harris 22 tractor. So as part of the conversion, what he did is he retained the Massey clutch assembly, starter, everything, made a crank adapter to go from the Volkswagen turbo diesel to the Massey Harris flywheel, and then made a bell housing adapter to go from the Volkswagen engine to the Massey Harris bell housing, which is pretty simple. So basically it's all Massey Harris stuff except for the engine. Now, when I got it, it wasn't running. He couldn't get it to run right. And of course, after sitting for a lot of years with probably not the proper precautions taken when the engine was stored, I determined that the injection pump was faulty. I could have had it rebuilt, but we had a non-turbo, so an NA pump laying around, so we jammed it on. So if you have noticed, it does not have the boost diaphragm on the top of the pump, which is fine. It has worked good just like this for the last 10 years, and it's actually technically a thing that they actually do sometimes. People will do to their car to make them better on fuel, is to remove that boost thing. It's actually called a eco diesel. And no, we're not talking about the Ram version that Dodge has made with that Fiat diesel about 5 years ago or so. This is actually a thing from about 20 years ago. Anyway, we got the pump installed. We got the engine running right. Everything, as you've seen, is the wiring is pretty rough. We basically wired everything really roughly just to get the tractor running because we weren't sure what was going to happen. Of course, this transmission, this differential had all been sitting in that same fence row, right? So we don't know what's going to happen. Like, is all the bearings going to blow up and grenade the transmission, or are the teeth going to be wrecked inside the transmission and basically just eat themselves to death, and this tractor runs for, you know, twice or whatever, and then it shreds itself. We didn't know, so we basically just slammed everything together to test it out. Well, we're still testing it out to this day, 12 years later. I've never fixed the wiring. I've really never fixed anything on it because it just works, so why mess with it? And when anything goes wrong, it's really easy to trace the wiring when you can see it and haven't bothered putting it in loom. So it's really easy to work on too. So it's not a priority really to clean it up. It works. It's ugly, but it works. The Volkswagen diesel gets probably about 6 times the fuel economy of that Continental gas engine ever would have. They were horrendous on, well, not horrendous, but it's a gas engine. They're not good on fuel to start with. These Volkswagen engines are incredible on fuel. Being it's an IDI, it's not as good of fuel as the TDIs, but it's still really, really good on fuel. So we fast forward about 8 years. One thing that's always been a problem on this thing was the starter. So the starter was originally meant for that flathead Continental gas engine, which was 6 volt, running a low compression gas engine, not turning over a high compression diesel. So obviously running a 6 volt starter on 12 volt, we rebuilt it a couple of times. I was told by the starter place that did it that it was not able to swap it over 12 volt. So after it burnt out the last time, I got tired of that and we had to do something different. If anybody knows anything about the Volkswagen diesels from the 80s, the clutch assembly is backwards to anything you think of nowadays. So it's not even possible to use the flywheel and pressure plate off an old Jetta. So I think that's the reason, part of the reason why he never did that and used the Massey stuff. What I did is, after it burnt out, I pulled the transmission out and the engine, and I used to have an old 1996 Volkswagen Jetta TDI, so an AHU engine code for any of you that understand. When I scrapped the car, the engine was getting tired. It had 800,000 or 900,000 K on it, so it was getting tired, but I kept the flywheel, the pressure plate, the starter, and the input shaft. Reason being is I like to build things. I like to build go-karts. I thought it'd be a great clutch setup for a go-kart. I didn't know what I'd use it for, but it's only this big, so it's easy to keep laying around. Well, I got measuring things. The bolt flange on the crank is exactly the same between the TDI and this Volkswagen indirect injected from the 1996, or from 1985. So I bolted up the flywheel, which worked out easy. It just 6 bolts and it bolts on. Got looking. The starter flange is the exact same bolt pattern as the indirect versus the TDIs. So I took my grandpa's spacer plate that he had made. I made extension housings because the starter goes in from the transmission side. Volkswagen does things really backwards. I made extension stubs that welded onto the adapter plate to basically space the starter out, the same as the transmission would have had to do to be in the perfect position to engage the flywheel. Really easy to do. I believe I have some pictures, so I'm pulling them up for you guys to show you what I've done. The input shaft was probably the hardest thing because Massey used a massive 1.25 inch, I think, input shaft. So obviously that's not going to fit the Volkswagen clutch disc. It doesn't even go through the hole on the pressure plate on the Volkswagen. It's a massive thing meant for a tractor. So I took that input shaft, I chopped it down, the Massey input shaft off the bell housing. I chopped it down. I chopped the Volkswagen input shaft that I had from my manual down. I spun it up in a lathe. I indexed it, I doweled it, and I trued it all up, and I welded it on. Reason being, I was going to get a pattern. I was making a pattern is what I was doing. So in the event that this worked out, because I really had no other choice at this point, in the event that this worked out, I could take it to a custom axle builder and get a custom input shaft made. I should do that probably. That was 2 years ago I did that. I haven't broken it yet, knock on wood, but it's still holding up. The release bearing, I was not able to use the Volkswagen one because of the size of the input shaft. Looking back, that's something I would do differently. But what I did is I made a sleeve that basically extended the input shaft because the Massey Harris flywheel is, I think it's like 3 inches thick. It's ridiculously heavy. It's also a lot of rotating mass. So you hit the throttle and it takes a while for the engine to actually spin that up. I think it's what Massey did to help with their torque curve. I'm not sure why they did it exactly, but on the Volkswagen, it almost didn't have enough power to spin that flywheel, actually. Like, it makes a lot of power, but Volkswagen's power is not down low. It's way high up on the RPM range. So it did have a lot of trouble spinning that flywheel. So I had to make a spacer for the release bearing for the clutch to space it out just to take up the difference in the flywheel. All really simple things if you've got a small lathe in your backyard and know how to use the thing. That's all I used, was a tiny little homeowner hobbyist lathe. I can't even think of what the name is. Oh, it's a Busy Bee lathe. So it's literally a homeowner's lathe from probably 1980 or so I used and built all this stuff. It was really easy to do as long as you know how to use the thing. Few things I don't like about this so far, of all the years, is one, I don't think the Volkswagen engine is really the best for this application. Only being is the Volkswagen engine makes no torque down low. Like a diesel farm tractor runs up to 15 or 1800 RPM, and that's the top end of their RPM range. All their torque is down low, like 1000 RPM, 1200, 1500 RPM. This Volkswagen engine is designed to run at 2000 RPM going down the road, and up from there, between 1800 and about 2200, which is kind of hard to keep it in that range on this thing. I find it's always falling off because first gear is pretty tall in this thing. So the RPM is always down low under the torque range. So the thing has got, once the torque starts coming down, it's got no power to bring it back up. It just stalls. So I don't know if that's the best application for this engine, but it's really cheap on fuel. And if you can get the RPMs up, the tires can't keep traction. It just spins them all day long, even with the chains on. It's got all kinds of power once the turbo starts coming. That's the problem too, is the turbo is designed to start doing something about 1800 RPM, not 14 or 1500 RPM. It does nothing at 1400 RPM, so you got no help from the turbo either. The other thing that I've noticed happened is the springs, since I use the Volkswagen clutch discs just to be simple off-the-shelf replacement, is the springs that are in the clutch disc have actually gotten compressed and flattened. So the Massey Harris clutch disc never had springs. It's just a solid mounted, like almost like a racing clutch, but it's a solid mounted, no springs in the clutch. Between the engine and the amount of power or amount of weight that I'm pulling, I've actually compressed the springs and the clutch just rattles and it's actually driving me nuts. I got to replace it. Trying to find one that doesn't have springs though is hard because that's basically like a stage 3 racing clutch. I don't know what else to do besides maybe if I can make spacers to go where the springs are and weld everything solid. That's the only thing that's really bothered me with everything that I'd done about 2 years ago. Other than that, it starts awesome because it's all factory Volkswagen stuff. You go to Napa, you can pick up a starter pretty much next day. Your flywheel, pressure plate, clutch disc is all off-the-shelf stuff. It's easy to get replacement for, not like the original Massey stuff was. But that clutch disc just being flattening the springs has been the biggest problem I've really had with this thing otherwise. Other than that, it's just been an incredible swap. It's had so much power. It's awesome on fuel. Pretty much if I'm doing something back in the bush, like we used to pull firewood with this thing for the last probably 10 years. That's how we heated our shop, was we hauled firewood in the wintertime. We'd cut trees down, drag them out full length, block them up in the spring, pile them up, and then a year and a half later we'd burn them. But when we were back in the bush cutting wood or cutting trees or just doing anything, we never shut the thing off. I'd burn about 20 bucks in fuel all summer running the thing. I'd put like 20 bucks worth of fuel in it all year. So you can't do that with the gas engine. That's one thing that's been incredible. Has been the fuel economy on this thing. It's just absolutely insane. The other thing that has been a bit of an issue is because this is a road-going engine. It does not have load sense governing. If you know what that means, every farm tractor has that. Any agricultural application, any industrial non-road application has it. So when you put a load on the engine automatically compensates that by essentially hitting the throttle harder. This pump does not do this because it's a road-going application. I'm sure that if I delve into the pump or had a pump shop do it, we could change the springs in it to make it load sense governing. I just have never gotten to it. Reason being is One, just time. Two, I don't really like messing with injection pumps. They're really, really not high tech, but just really tight tolerances, and really you can't get any dirt into them or you wreck them. That's been one of the biggest things, is just having a proper clean. And if you do something wrong, you could blow the engine up. So I've been a little leery on that. But the pump is very similar to a 4BT Cummins that was used in a lot of agricultural and industrial applications back in the late 80s. The pump is very, very similar to that. So I'm wondering if there should be a way to change the springs, or if something else. I've just never delved into it, and I've never put an aftermarket governor on. So I do have to play with the throttle all the time, which is kind of a bit annoying. But otherwise, it's well worth the fuel economy, the extra power, and the simplicity. Because if any of you know anything about gas engines, they're very finicky. The carburetor is always messing up. These old tractors that had points in them, the points are always messing up. It's just one hassle after another. I like diesels myself. I'm a very big fan of diesels, because while they are maybe more complex in the injection system, they just work. They're almost simpler as far as I'm considered. They're simpler, they work, they just last, they're better on fuel, more power. Like, there's really, to me, no downside to a diesel. A gas engine has all the downsides as far as I'm considered. I hate gas engines with a passion. That's just me personally. But I'm a very big diesel fan just for all those reasons. And of course, this thing being a diesel just makes it extra cool. One thing I was wondering too is with the extra power of the engine, if it would destroy anything in the transmission or rear end, being how they were built for probably a lot less horsepower. After working on this transmission this summer, I had to put a transmission bearing in it. The transmission is ridiculously overbuilt on this thing for probably the horsepower. You could probably double the horsepower and you would never hurt it. The only thing is, one thing I don't like about this transmission too, which doesn't really relate to the engine, it relates to the tractor. It's not very serviceable. It's a real pain to do any work on the transmission, just the way they've got everything jammed together. The transmission and rear end are one unit, casted one piece. You can't split anything. But even if you have to pull one shaft out to change one bearing, you have to disassemble the whole thing into a pile of parts just to get one shaft out, because this shaft is locked by this shaft, which is locked by this shaft, and you have to move this shaft back a 1/4 inch, move this shaft a 1/4 inch, sneak this shaft up, tuck this shaft up. It's not very serviceable. It's really, really hard to do anything on this thing. It's probably very robust the way it's built, but it's not very serviceable. I had this thing down to absolutely nothing, just to change one simple transmission bearing that should have been a half-hour job on any other transmission that I've ever worked on. Well, maybe not half-hour, but a very simple job on just about any other transmission I've ever been into. This thing is really, really, really hard to work on, but it's also really overbuilt. It's got 2-inch diameter shafts inside this thing. The engine has never hurt anything. Now, the tires are not loaded. That is one thing I would do, is I would load the tires to take advantage of all the power. There's so much power that the tires cannot get traction. So loaded tires would definitely help with that. Now, of course, that puts more stress on all the transmission shafts and the axle shafts and everything too. So it's kind of you might start doing damage. I don't know. The other thing is, on these tractors, the brake system is horrendous from the factory. They basically don't work. They have this kind of a cam disc set up, and it's really terrible. And if you're going backwards, the rotation of the axle actually disengages your brakes and turns them off. It's really hard to hold anything like, say, like a loaded wagon or a loaded manure spreader if you have to stop going up a hill for someone to open a gate or something. It's really hard to hold it there because of the design of the brakes. It's just not a good design of the brakes. Some of the bigger Masseys, like the 22s, the 30s and stuff, used a conventional brake system like you would find on a pickup truck. I have no experience with those, but I wonder if they might be a better setup. Now, don't get me wrong talking about what I don't like. The pros outweigh the cons on this thing 1,000,000 to 1. If I wanted something that had live PTO, 3-point hitch, any of that sorts of things, I would be obviously getting a newer tractor. But when it comes to working in the bush, this thing is incredible. It's tiny. It's narrow. It's very short. So it turns around in tiny little places that you would never get a newer tractor into. Like, and I mean newer by like even 30 years newer than this thing. You wouldn't get those tractors into the places this thing will go into. So for getting logs or firewood out of really tight bush trails, it is great for that. It's also quite light. So if you do sink it in a swamp up to the running boards, don't ask me how I know this. I did that this summer. I didn't catch it on the video, but I had it up to about here in mud and it was stuck. A little, I think 1,500-pound come along and a chain, and we pulled the thing out. We had to get enough chain to get to a tree because of where I was actually stuck. It was not hard to get out because the tractor itself is very light. Also, it floats a lot more than most tractors would be because the whole thing is lighter. So if you're going across rough ground, it floats instead of sinking most of the time. So that is a benefit, and working in tight places is obviously a benefit, plus the fuel economy. You can go out for 2 days on a small tank of fuel, get a ton of work done on $10 worth of diesel. You couldn't do that with most other tractors. So that is one thing, is the fuel economy and the maneuverability is massive upsides for this thing. Now, some of you have noticed too, I don't have the hood on it. So this tank right here is not the original. I don't know what this tank's off of, but the original tank has been repaired probably 6 times. I think I've done 2 or 3 of the repairs, and it keeps leaking on the seams. Every few years you repair a seam, and one of the crimp seams starts leaking again. And a couple years ago that happened again. So I found this tank laying around. I jammed it on with the intention of getting a new tank built, or if someone can maybe weld it up better. I don't know. The soldering doesn't seem to last very long, or just any sorts of repairs I've done, just because the metal's so thin in places. Obviously, I haven't got around to doing it. I do have the hood for it, and I used to run it up until I had to change the tank. This one, the filler neck's in the wrong spot, and it's a little too wide that the hood won't fit on. Otherwise, I don't have much body panels. As you can see, the rear fenders are rotten. Like, the tractor itself is not worth fixing up, and that's why this one never got fixed up or anything, was the tin work is just destroyed. Most of it is even missing. I do have a few little bits of tin work, but they're in really rough shape. Anything good was basically stripped off this tractor and used for the row crop restoration, namely the frame. So this tractor was basically a hunk of scrap metal. So I guess back to how I ended up with it. Fast forward a few years, he got the engine in, and it was not finished, but he got sick, health issues. So he was not able to finish it, so it was, the term bastardized, I guess, would be the best one to put on it. So he didn't want to sell the tractor to anybody or even give it to anybody because it was a one-of-a-kind and not even really finished, not really usable. Well, he had a 4000 Ford, and he had a front tire go bad on it, and he was not really in the best of shape to fix it, health-wise. So I was working at a tire shop as a tire technician just out of high school at this time. So we made a deal on the tractor because I had a great interest in it. I looked at it and I seen potential in the thing. And so I made a deal with him because he was going to take it to scrap. So he would have got, at that time, probably 150, 200 bucks in scrap weight because the price of scrap was down. So I made a deal with him. I took the tire off his 4000. I took it to where I worked. I bought the brand new tire. I put it on the rim. I fixed it up, or installed it, new tube, everything. I took the tire back home. I put it back on his tractor, got his tractor going for him, everything for the price of this tractor. So it actually cost me probably a bit of money, more than he would have made on scrap over this thing. But he was happy. He had his tractor back that he could tinker with. He just liked to go out and even just drive around with it. It got him out of the house. So it got him back into doing something that he wanted to do and gave him his excuse to go outside. Even though he wasn't well, it got him his excuse to go outside, get some fresh air, and somewhat do what he wanted to do in exchange for, I got the tractor for basically scrap price, because that's what he was going to do with it, was just take it to scrap just to get rid of it, and because it was not really a finished project. So I got it really cheap. I had to do a bunch of work to it, obviously, because it didn't run. I've had to do some other things to it over the years, just little minute things, but otherwise it's been a really solid workhorse, a really solid conversion, and it's always worked pretty much, except for when it's really cold and it won't turn over. But other than that, that's just, the normal stuff. Other than that, it's just worked. Like, this thing has just been a pure workhorse. We've used it every winter. We've used it every summer. It's worked its last 12 years of its life, probably more than it had the first 30 years of its life. I'm guessing. I don't know what it did, but it's done a serious amount of work in the last 12 years for me, and it's just been a fun little thing. And of course, it's another diesel, so I just love the thing. For those of you who reach out in the comments section asking for more information on this tractor and asking for this video of how this thing became to be, I hope this answers your questions. If you have any more, obviously leave them in the comment section, and I will try my best to answer them. But I think I've explained pretty much everything I've done to it. It's actually a really simple conversion, more or less. Other than that single adapter plate, that was probably the hardest part, I'm assuming. I never built it, so I don't know how hard the adapter plate was to build. For anybody that does know their way around any sorts of milling machines or anything, can probably figure out how to build a pretty simple adapter plate themselves. It's really not that complex, but that's probably the hardest part of this, other than making motor mounts and just your basic fab stuff. It was really, as far as I'm considered looking at it and the work I've done to it, really an easy conversion, almost. Other than a few little simple things, like it's not hard to stick in. The engine itself is about the same size as the original gas engine that came out of here. So like even frame-wise, it just fits right in there, other than it originally would have had a mechanical fan on the gas engine. I've had to put an electric fan on because Volkswagens don't have a provision for mechanical fans. So I had to do simple little things like that. But other than that, it's actually a really simple conversion. And I would probably do it again if I had a way of maybe getting more torque out of it. That's my biggest thing, is the torque. I don't know if you could change a camshaft or what you could do to get more torque out of this, because that is about the biggest thing, is torque. Even getting going, it doesn't have as much torque as the original gas engine would have. That is probably about the biggest issue. Especially road gear. Road gear is really tall in this transmission. So you actually got to take off in third, and then you got to float the gears, same as you do in a big truck, like in a semi-truck, to get into fourth gear while you're moving. It's the only way to get going. You can't take off from a stop. It just doesn't have the power, or it doesn't have the torque, I guess, to take off. Maybe a TDI would have more torque. I know they do have more bottom end torque, so maybe that would get it moving. Or even just like the torque issues that I have, like I've pulled a plow with it, and as long as you can keep the RPMs up pulling a plow, you can move. But again, first gear is almost too tall in this tractor, so you really can't keep the RPM screaming, or you're flying down the field with that plow, and you almost can't control the plow at that point. But if you keep the RPMs down where you can control it, if you do get into, like, say, tighter soil, or you start picking up a rock or something, the RPMs just drop and you stall the tractor out. There's another thing too, if you hit a hill while you're running a manure spreader, between the power it takes to run the manure spreader and the hill, again, you can't keep the RPMs too high, because then the PTO speed is too high. Because the PTO is geared for the original engine, you overspeed your PTO implement, but then you also your RPM is too low, you don't have your power band, so you hit a hill and the manure spreader and your RPM start dropping. It's, from that aspect, from a working tractor, it doesn't work very well. But working in a bush, it's incredible. And that's the best application for this, I think. The fuel economy too, it's just ridiculously cheap on fuel. Being how it's a diesel, it's simple. It basically just runs. You put fuel and oil in the thing and it goes. It's as simple as that. There's no messing with carburetors or electronic ignition or any of that junk. I hate that stuff. This is just simple. It works. And at the end of the day, it sounds cool too, because it's a turbo diesel and it's straight piped. It has no muffler on it. So for any of you that know what a Volkswagen diesel sounds like straight pipe, it's what this thing sounds like. It's just hysterical. It catches a lot of attention because, one, it smokes sometimes. It blows smoke because it's a diesel, and because it doesn't sound like it should. It's an old tractor and it should not sound like a turbo diesel. So it catches people's attention a lot from that aspect. Anyway, I think we have answered pretty much all your questions. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope this is as interesting as the people who had asked for this and does give them the information that they had wanted. Thank you, everybody.